Hello, welcome to Cognitations, a podcast where we interview cognitive scientists about their work and how it can help us answer all of our questions about the mind. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind and comprises domains such as the neurosciences, cognitive psychology, linguistics, philosophy, computer science, and more. Without further ado, let's jump into today's episode.
Welcome to Cognitations. We are today's hosts. I'm Tanay.
And I'm Jay.
Our appearance is very important to us. This is evident when we look at advertisements or online trends, such as what the youth call looksmaxxing, or simply reflect on the amount of time we spend looking at a mirror in the morning. For decades, theories in evolutionary psychology state that humans are attracted to specific physical features. Think of symmetrical faces, for instance. The story goes that humans everywhere should share these appearance or attractiveness preferences as they are signals of health and fertility. Is this really the case? Are these universal preferences? Our guest today, Lynda Boothroyd, has long questioned the universality of these preferences by studying them across very diverse communities in Nicaragua. Welcome, Lynda, to the show.
Hello.
So just to sort of build a personal narrative here, how did you get interested in studying what humans find attractive?
Oh, blimey. I was at school, actually. It was the very first piece of coursework I did for my A-level psychology. So for those outside the UK, A-levels is what you study between 16 and 18. And I did a piece of coursework on the matching hypothesis and the idea that people like someone who's a similar level of attractiveness to them. And then it just went from there all the way through university, and then that's what I ended up doing my PhD on.
Nice. And what drew you to, what was particularly interesting to you about the matching hypothesis?
Well, I don't think I was especially interested in the matching hypothesis per se. It's a very classic piece of social psychology that people tend to mix on levels of attractiveness. And it's part of a much broader phenomenon known as assortative mating, which is basically we tend to end up with people who are similar to us in all sorts of different ways. But I was really interested in what is it that we find aesthetically interesting about other people. And I think probably some of that came from being a very awkward, socially unpopular teenager who was just like really interested in like, well, why do these people get more attention? I mean, I'm sure a little part of it was that. But also I like looking at people. You know, I have those reactions when I look at people, and some people I look at and think, I just want to sit and look at you because you're so beautiful. So it's really interesting to me to see where that came from, and especially being a teenager in the mid-late 90s, the appearance ideals that we had at that point were quite controversial. So I don't know if you've heard of heroin chic.
No.
But oh yeah, so I was reading all these magazines as a teenage girl, you know, with supermodels in them, and then Kate Moss sort of exploded into the world, and this very, very thin, emaciated aesthetic became quite popular. So there was an awful lot of cultural discussion at that time around weight ideals, for instance. So I think that all gets rolled together, that just being in that environment where this was a thing that was generally interesting to me, and then it was so culturally important at that time as well.
Gotcha. It would be quite interesting if someone did some research on the amount of social science research that comes out of teenage angst.
Yeah, I mean, I think what do they say? Research is me search.
Yeah,
we all got it in there somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so as we said in the kind of introduction, for some time evolutionary psychologists had assumed that like there's these universally attractive features in humans. Why did they make such an assumption?
So I think I'm going to start all this off by saying I really came from an evolutionary psychology background, and evolutionary psychology is the reason I did not quit psychology in my first term at university. Like it really made me go, okay, no, I don't have to deal with cognitive psychology all the time and neurons all the time. There's something that's really interesting here. So I think it partly comes from the fact that people were looking, for instance, at animal behavior. So we think about Muller's research on symmetry preference, for instance, in non-human animals. He was producing these studies saying, well, we think in these animals, symmetry is indicating good underlying health. So then it's quite a logical thing to go, okay, well, if birds are more healthy, if they're more symmetric, maybe humans are too, and maybe we'll also show this preference. So what's being studied there is what are like the cross-species universals of mate choice. And I think it's also it's to be expected when a new field is emerging. And bear in mind, no one was even able to start really identifying features that people considered attractive until the 1980s, because the technology didn't exist to do it. That you initially start out by going, oh, look, people like this thing, people like this thing. And it's exciting to find things that people seem to agree on. Because within cultures, we often do agree on who's the most attractive, you know. Again, when I was a teenager, Brad Pitt was the most beautiful man on earth. And everyone I knew almost agreed with that. So it's one of those things where it's not unreasonable to start there. The problem is if we get stuck there. And I think to some extent that's a little bit what's happened in some cases, that we've tended to focus on some of these universals at the expense of realizing that actually for us as humans, these aren't things that are hardwired. I think I'm going to caveat that answer by saying that evolutionary psychologists also started looking at systematic variation very early on, so that we like some things in some circumstances and not in others. But again, that was this idea that, well, if you want a short-term relationship, you must be looking for these things which are markers of good genetic quality. And if you are looking for a long-term relationship, you must be looking for these things that are markers of a good partner and a good parent in your partner. So although that idea of variation did come in very early on, I think it starts about 1993 with Buss and Schmidt looking at what people scored different traits. And then we start to see it in actual physical attraction studies by the late 90s. It was still taking a very everyone has the same adaptation that is shifting their preferences in the same way kind of approach.
So early on, you sort of mentioned that this was a sort of cross-species investigation. And you
Yeah.
mentioned that birds also show some of these preferences. Are there any other animals that also seem to show these preferences?
So some people have looked at face preferences in macaques. So you see, I think, a preference for redness in macaques. This is rhesus macaques, who are a very common laboratory animal. That could be to do with health in terms of blood oxygenation in the skin. It could be to do with dominance as well. And there's some work, for instance, in sticklebacks about redder males potentially again being healthier partners, bigger females being good because they'll lay more eggs. There's some work with zebra finches where you can change the color of the ankle rings that's on them, and that makes them more or less popular. So you can artificially make a male zebrafish more popular with the female zebrafish by just changing the color on his ankle. And then he spends less time building nests and more time going around and mating with other males, mates.
So coming on to humans then, you mentioned facial symmetry. What are some other features that evolutionary psychologists at the time thought were universally attractive features?
So symmetry, not just in the face, but also in the body. Femininity in the face and in the body. So a more feminine face, sort of eyes that look bigger because your facial bones are smaller, and sort of smaller chin, smaller forehead, slightly fuller lips. And then femininity in the body, so we're talking about curviness of the waist. And then there's been back and forth about what's going on with breasts for a long time. Initially, there was this assumption that women would prefer masculine-faced men because we've got this divergence in faces between men and women, and therefore potentially that's supported by sexual selection. But actually, that was the first big shock, I think, was that women did not necessarily like the more masculine-faced men. Some studies found that they were preferring men on the feminine side of sort of the mid-range of masculinity for men. Some studies found that women didn't really care. Some did find they were slightly on the masculine side. So that was a very early indicator that actually, no, we needed to be looking at other explanations, which is where the idea that you like a different partner in different contexts comes in. And then averageness is the other one as well.
Is a masculine face just like the opposite of how you described a feminine face, like bigger
Yes,
chin,
yeah.
smaller lips?
So
Okay,
yeah, it's because male faces grow more during puberty. So all your craniofacial bones get bigger. So your jaw gets bigger, your nose gets bigger, your forehead gets heavier. Because that's all growing, your eyes look smaller, although our eyeballs are actually on average the same size. And you also find that men tend to have slightly redder skin, slightly rougher skin than women do, and obviously facial hair. Whereas women, although our faces do change during puberty, they don't grow as much.
And just because when you gave the examples for other species,
Yeah.
you gave the kind of gist of like the explanation.
Yeah.
But for humans, what would, like, for each of the features you've given us?
So for symmetry, it was the same idea, that it indicates underlying health, because if you're growing nice and symmetric, it means that nothing's happening to tip you off. A way I like to explain it to people is if you run your tongue along the roof of your mouth, you should be able to feel the line. That's where the two halves of your palate fuse. And if you can imagine that line is like a line running all the way down your body, apart from things like your heart, which you only have one of, most things where you've got two of them ought to be symmetric on either side of that line. And so the more asymmetry, what's called fluctuating asymmetry, which is asymmetry that arises randomly rather than systematic asymmetry. So everyone smiles more on one side of the face than the other. That's systematic. We don't worry about that. But the sort of random asymmetries that arise can happen because you've been ill, because you've had a knock of some kind. I don't know if you can see my thumbs. I have a little dwarf thumb. I fell on that thumb as a toddler, and then it didn't grow properly. So that's an example of where, like, an environmental assault, so something happening to you, disrupts your symmetry. So the idea, therefore, is that people who are more symmetric are more robust because they've grown in a way that has resisted all these environmental assaults. They haven't been as ill, and therefore, if you have children with that person, those children will inherit that good condition, and therefore your genes will be more successful. And some people also suggested that being average, so being relatively close to population average in terms of the size of your facial features, might also be an underlying indicator of health. For femininity, the argument was that more feminine features indicated higher levels of estrogen, which meant that you were more fertile. So for men, if they need to reproduce, they need a fertile female to reproduce with. So the idea was that these facial features and these body features were a way of identifying a good candidate for having offspring. Not that that's a conscious motivation, but that those who preferred those things in the past will have been more successful, and therefore it becomes a preference that is sort of ingrained in us. And then masculinity was a bit of a tricky one. So again, there was an early suggestion that it indicated healthiness. As I and other people went on to demonstrate, that's a really, really weak explanation for human masculinity preferences. We do not have good evidence that masculinity indicates health in humans. Alternatively, some people have suggested it's about dominance, which potentially brings resources, but then we get into all the arguments about, well, actually, in different human contexts, resources are required in lots of different ways. And actually, it's a bit of a weak explanation. But the main thing it often came down to is, well, the reason you don't want a more masculine men for a long-term relationship is because all the testosterone makes them aggressive and, again, engage in social dominant behaviors, social dominance behaviors that you don't want in your long-term partner.
But like, it seems like we call these features masculine or feminine, but what we really mean is just like high estrogen or high testosterone. Isn't that a bit problematic already? Because it's like it's kind of like a shortcut, right? In a sense. Do you think
Well,
it created like scientific problems?
so I think, to be honest, when we call it masculinity, the other word we use, which is actually more technically correct, is sexual dimorphism. So we're looking at the size and shape differences between men and women on average. And I think it's important that we are using like facial masculinity or facial dimorphism for the studies looking at faces, because that's what's being manipulated and that's what's being measured. So if I'm measuring your facial dimorphism preference, I am literally taking a face and moving it up and down the continuum from male shape to female shape. I'm not dialing up and down a man's testosterone. But I think you're right that we were doing this research on dimorphism and masculinity, and we were making the assumption that that was mapping onto testosterone or estrogen in women. And that's one of the things that has sort of come out more over the last decades, is it's actually quite hard to justify the extent of that assumption. So yes, testosterone is important in the masculinization of the face in puberty. So if you give boys with delayed puberty testosterone injections, they go through puberty and their face gets more masculine. But there's not I don't think we have strong convincing evidence that there's this nice linear relationship between how high your testosterone levels were, let alone how high your testosterone levels are now, years after your face finished growing, and how masculine your face is. There's all sorts of non-linear effects that could be happening there. And when it comes to estrogen and female faces, it's even worse.
Okay.
So already in your answer here, you sort of alluded to how people in attractiveness research went about measuring preferences. But for our listeners, could you maybe sort of spell out the strategy that evolutionary psychologists use to historically test these claims?
Yeah. So, I mean, this goes back to early social psychology. It's definitely not unique to evolutionary psychology. So the very earliest studies on human attractiveness basically showed people photos and said, how attractive is this person? And you get enough people to rate them for attractiveness, and you tend to see a reasonable level of agreement such that you only need like a dozen people doing that rating before you can go, okay, I have a pretty good estimate of how attractive this person is considered in this context by these people. So that's what people used to do. They just used to measure attractiveness of faces. And then in the early 1980s, because of they used police photo fit kits. So you'd switch in eyes, noses, and you'd literally build a face from a photo fit kit. And that's when they started going, okay, what happens if we make the eyes bigger or smaller and things like that. Then in the late 80s, researcher Cunningham started showing people lots of faces, having them rated for attractiveness, and then literally measuring the size of features and looking at what correlated between how big your nose is and how attractive you were rated. But it's really when you get to the 1990s, particularly the late 90s, when computer graphic technology has advanced enough that we can start actually computer graphically manipulating faces, that we can really start digging into some of these more difficult to assess constructs like symmetry. Because you can do measurements of symmetry, but once you've got good computer graphics, you can manipulate symmetry. So you can take a real face and you can exaggerate how asymmetric it is, or you can take away the asymmetries And you can show people these two pictures and go, right, which one do you like best? It also means that you can work out the average male shape in a sample and work out the average female shape in a sample, and then again manipulate an image on that difference. So that's what we've generally done with faces, is use increasingly really computer graphic techniques to isolate different aspects of facial appearance and look at how that affects people's perceptions of attractiveness.
Does this also...
And-
Sorry, go ahead, Jay.
No, I'm just curious about like how the studies on faces work, because like the way humans process sort of faces visually is very like special, right?
Yeah.
In a sense, like we're super experts for processing
Yeah.
faces, and the visual system seems to process them like very holistically, right? So we don't see faces as like a nose plus a mouth plus
Yeah.
eyes. We see them as like a whole thing. Does this complicate these studies, like in how you like manipulate certain features and?
Not really, because I mean, part of the advantage of that is that you can use sometimes even quite basic approaches like a photo fit kit and just trust that the person looking at this will then holistically process it. And the fact that you've spliced together different features won't matter quite so much, because they're going to process it as a face and they'll integrate it. But I think there's certainly been some discussion in the literature over the years about to what extent we prioritize faces over everything else. So some people have argued that because faces draw our attention more than bodies, we should really just be focusing on faces. Other people have said, well, but there's lots of information in the body, and I think it depends what you're assessing and to what extent it's a trait that is primarily manifest in the face versus the body. I think like there's a couple of studies, well, it's more than a couple. There's several studies that look at facial adiposity, so how much weight you have on your face. And I think that's an interesting thing to study because it definitely does affect our perceptions of faces. But of course, the most important piece of information you can have about someone's weight isn't their face, it's their body, because it's much easier to see than the face. And similarly, studies where they've said, well, facially masculine men have stronger hands and more muscle, so it's useful to look at how facially masculine someone is to know like how good they'll be in a fight. To which again, my instinctive response is always, if we think about humans, as a species, for the vast majority of humans, for the vast majority of our existence, if you could see someone's face, you could also see their body. And if you want to know how muscular someone is, you look at their arms, not at their face. So I think because we like looking at faces, I think sometimes we over focus on information in faces that actually, for most of the time, whatever information in the face is completely superfluous to the information from the body. But I would say that because I've gone from faces to bodies, so that's my bias, I suppose.
So far, the measurement picture that you painted out for us for evolutionary psychology back in the day is sort of looking at this preference. You're showing people a bunch of images and then you're asking people about their preferences.
Yeah.
But what about this missing piece of actually seeing whether those features lead to any evolutionary benefits?
Yeah, so that's harder because ultimately what you want to be able to demonstrate is that people with these features have children who are healthier, or they have more children, to demonstrate that this benefit really did exist in our ancestral past. And the problem there is that if you're primarily working in industrialized countries, so in the global north, like in the US, in the UK, Australia, Japan, the participants that you're working with have really good medical care. So almost all their children survive to adulthood anyway. They have contraception, easily accessible contraception. So it is extremely easy to control how many children you have. And there are ways to control that in pre-industrial contexts as well, but perhaps not quite so easily as we can. And therefore, any health and fertility data that you have in Western contexts and other urban industrialized contexts is always going to be much less useful than you would like for assessing these benefits. So, which is why then you need to be working in populations that don't have the medicine, don't have the same easy contraceptives. But we have very little data that's really addressing these questions. And certainly where I've been involved both in synthesizing the data we do have and working with anthropologists to analyze their data directly, we haven't got particularly good evidence that these benefits exist. And although, yes, we're saying these are benefits that would have existed, 100,000 years ago, if they're that fundamental that masculinity indicates good immune system, or symmetry indicates good immune system, and femininity indicates fertility, we really still ought to see those things playing out in non-contracepting, low medical care contexts. And either we simply don't have any data, or the data we have is not convincing.
Gotcha.
So this is a good segue onto the next question, which is about some studies you've run
Yes.
in such communities and communities with like low access to media, for
Yeah.
example. So yeah, what were the places in question, and how did the theories about universally attractive features hold up?
So I think there's probably two different studies that it's useful to talk about at this point. One is a study I did using archive data from anthropologists. So we used data from the Agta, who are hunter-gatherers in the Philippines, and from Maya farmers from Belize. So I didn't go to these places. I didn't collect any of this data, but some very nice anthropologists gave me access to their data and their photographs, which meant that we were able to look at how masculine, but also how attractive, even how healthy these individuals looked, and at the mortality rates of their offspring. So again, there was this idea that masculine faces were an indicator of good underlying health, because testosterone is supposed to be immunosuppressive. So if you can grow this very masculine face in puberty, you must have been really healthy to start out with to tolerate the testosterone suppressing your immune system. That was the hypothesis. So we got the faces rated for masculinity. They weren't fully standardized, so we couldn't measure it, but we could at least get perceived masculinity in both the Philippines hunter-gatherers and the farmers in Belize. And then I looked at their offspring mortality rates. And what I found was that actually it was the men who were like in the middle or even slightly on the feminine side, in terms of their perceived masculinity, that had the best offspring survival rates. So offspring mortality went up if you're at the very feminine, but it also went up if you're on the masculine side. So that rather suggested that actually being more masculine doesn't make your children more healthy and more likely to survive. There's been a related study looking at vocal masculinity, so voice pitch, in Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. And they likewise found there was no association between how deep the father's voice was and the mortality rate of his offspring, again suggesting there's no real connection between masculinity and offspring survival, offspring health, offspring outcomes. So that's the absolute critical test, is can we actually see any benefit to the offspring in these contexts? And we couldn't. Likewise, when we tried to bring together data on body shape or facial femininity and offspring number for women, we've generally either not had the data or the data has not shown an association between how feminine your face is, how feminine your body shape is, and how many children you have. So again, looking at other people's data in lots of different contexts, we've not found much evidence. And then at the same time as I was working with the archive data, I was running a project in rural Nicaragua. So we were working with communities in an area where they were just recently getting access to television. So it was an area where the government was rolling out electricity lines through the forested and lagoon areas on the Caribbean coast. And basically, you'd have these communities that were really close together. And if one was on the route between two large communities, they got electricity because the pylons were going past them. And if they weren't on that route, they didn't get it. And that means you can look at people who do and don't have access to Western or any kind of visual media, but that are otherwise really quite comparatively similar. Because there's been this discussion for years about, oh, well, people in low-income countries, they like big women for this reason or that reason. Is it hunger? Is it media? Is it disease? And the problem is that as a country becomes more globalized and more industrialized, all of these things change at the same time. So what was really amazing in Nicaragua is that we could look at the effect of getting access to television in communities where their access to food wasn't changing and their broad levels of industrialization weren't really changing either. And what we found was that in terms of female bodies, people liked thinner bodies if they had access to television. The people who were watching more television liked thinner bodies than people watching less television. People who were watching more television liked curvier bodies. So if we think about waist-hip ratio, a curvy shape indicating femininity. In the stimuli that we were using in our main project, that preference was stronger amongst those who were watching more television. And then we also looked at their facial femininity and masculinity preferences. And the really striking thing for me was that even though it's very difficult to link it to fertility, if I show masculinized versus feminized female faces to people in any industrialized, any urban context, any online sample, they will always favor the feminized female face. It's incredibly robust. And then we got this data from like 7 communities in rural Nicaragua, and they didn't care. They didn't have a femininity preference, and it's not that Nicaraguans are weird, because we had data from the capital city with urban Nicaraguans who watch TV all the time. They're fully industrialized and globalized. They show a femininity preference. They like feminine female faces, but all of these people in the rural areas, even the ones who did have TV access, actually, they didn't care. And we went back to them later, and because this was so confusing, so we went back and said, look, here's a stimuli that we were showing people in your communities. Everyone in the West likes this face over this face. You guys don't seem to. What's going on? And they were looking at these faces that we were showing them, saying, so either they were saying, well, I don't really see a difference, or they were saying, this one looks more clear, which means they were saying it looks whiter. And there's no color change. There's only shape change. Or they were saying like, oh, this one just looks happier. But they couldn't see the manipulation the way that we saw it. And they certainly didn't care about it.
But another thing about faces is that because we're so specialized, we're also specialized for the general kinds of faces we tend to grow up around, right? And like the window in which you learn to recognize faces. What were the stimuli that were shown? Were they like were they like faces of like white people in the West?
No, they were Salvadoran. So they were
Salvadoran. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so they weren't Nicaraguan, but they were Central American, what we'd call mestizo. So they have that sort of mixed European indigenous descent, Central American features. And we didn't see any difference between the mestizo communities, so the ones for whom these were literally sort of ethnically the closest match, and the indigenous or Afro descent communities. None of them cared. So I mean that and the interesting thing about it is that I then went, right, I'm going to look at every single Latin American data set I can find. Because other people had also been looking at rural, not connected communities around this time as well. And it was really striking when I put together like the means from all the different studies that very clearly I found it pulling all these data sets together in Latin America, but there's one paper that's looked across multiple continents as well. The people who show the facial femininity preference in female faces are people who are recruited online or in urban, higher income contexts. So it's either people from like global north, high income country contexts, or when it's in the global south, in low middle income countries, it's people who are online or in cities. And the more rural and what we call small scale context or less industrialized or indigenous, but not necessarily indigenous communities, they were all much less interested in female facial femininity. And I think given what we also now know, that female body shape preferences are also different depending on the amount of contact you have with like globalized media or other forms of globalization in a way that can't just be explained by things like hunger. It really does suggest that our level of interest in not just really in hyperfemininity, so having a very feminine face, a very feminine body shape, more so than the average person, is potentially something that is evolutionarily novel. And I'm not the first person to say that, but I think I'm maybe the first person to say that I think the evidence is now overwhelming that a lot of the things we thought were evolved preferences aren't. They're things we're acquiring in some other way.
Yeah, so that was going to be another question. You basically did the transition to the next question, which is, so you think it's like learning in some way? Can you explain more how that works?
Yeah. So if we go back to earlier in the conversation when we were talking about averageness, and so there have been a set of researchers who've been saying for a long time that, well, we think averageness is the key to attractiveness. So to explain slightly how this works, the idea is when it comes to faces, for instance, that we conceptualize faces, or our brain represents faces in this kind of multi-dimensional face space. And that you have your central template of a face, and any face you see, you have to code in your brain by activating neurons which indicate how the face differs from this central prototype, or this central template. So you might have a neuron that fires more with big noses, and you might have a neuron that fires more with big eyes, or something like that. And so the more a face differs from this template, the more effortful it is for your brain to just process it. And we do know from like non-human stimuli that things that are effortful to process, we just like slightly less than things that are easy to process. It's been done with words, it's been done with random patterns. And so there's this argument that basically less average, what's called more distinctive faces, are harder to process. They're more cognitively costly, and therefore we like them less. The comeback and the counter argument to that was always, but we like some things that are not average more than averageness. We like feminine faces more than average faces. And that is true when you look at Western data. that we tend to, if I get you if I create a composite of really feminine female faces, you'll like that more than the composite of all faces in that sample. We also like people who are healthier than average. And I think what the work I and others have been doing more recently adds to that debate is that what we think of as a typical face, that template we know can be changed through visual experience. So the people you look at more affect that template more, because it's always updating, it's always developing, it's not static. And we can show this experimentally. We've shown it with bodies in children. Other people have shown it with faces in children. People have shown it with faces in Hadza hunter-gatherers. We've shown it with bodies in rural Nicaragua. If you give people a whole load of faces or bodies that are similar in a certain way, afterwards they like faces or bodies that are also like that. So we can change what people think is average. And the thing is, what we think is average isn't just about the people around us, it's also about the people we see on TV or magazines, if we have them. And so potentially part of this disagreement between is it averageness or is it something else is because that something else is hyper represented in media. So you could get for whatever reason, and I don't think we have all the puzzle pieces for how this happened historically yet, but if you get for whatever reason a bias towards a particular individual or group of individuals, they become more dominant visually if you have visual culture that can replicate them. That then changes everyone's visual diet, whether they have contact with those individuals directly or not. And that then creates this is attractive because it's closer to my brain's template, and my brain's template is not just based on the people around me. So that might be where we're getting some of this discrepancy between an actually average face and the faces people find most attractive. That's what I'm arguing in a paper I've just submitted. So we'll see if my colleagues agree with me.
Well, I was curious here, could you, this claim that you make, could you not just test it in a small scale society that is under subjugation by a larger, let's say, nation state, and where
What you mean in terms of, do people prefer the faces or bodies that look like the dominant?
the oppressor, let's say.
I mean, one thing we did in Nicaragua was look at skin color preference, because again, we thought once people got access to TV, they might prefer whiter faces or more European features. We had it was a little bit naive, even though we were a team of anthropologists and psychologists. We hadn't factored in just how strong the baseline whiteness preference would be, even in the non-media and less connected communities, because obviously there's so much historical colorism, and that was a stronger underlying factor than I had probably anticipated, which I think just goes to show I'm a white woman living in Europe, and therefore it's less obvious to me. But even so, despite that, we still found that the people who were more educated and the people who were watching more TV did show a stronger preference specifically for images where we'd been manipulating color, without there being any effect of whether the face had been manipulated for shape. That was so I found that interesting. So basically it wasn't that watching TV or being educated tipped them one way or the other to what extent they did or did not feel averse to, African versus European features or mestizo versus European features. But how we were changing the skin tone did make a difference. And certainly the argument, the explanation for why education was so important here was put forward by a collaborator of mine from Nicaragua who herself is Creole. And her explanation was simply, the more educated you get, the more opportunities you might have if you can get them, and the more aware you are of the importance of whiteness in that context. But we were certainly seeing, in terms of anecdotal sort of ethnographic observation, that the preference for whiteness was quite common, and it's I mean, I've come across other sociological arguments around this in other contexts as well, but this idea of at least having children who are whiter, because then they'll be more successful. So you want a partner with lighter skin, for instance. So you certainly do see how colorism plays out, I think, ties into that to a certain extent.
Mhm. So this alternative account that you also develop with learning being like the key component of it, a naive, let's say, listener might say that if all of this is learning, is there no role of evolution here anymore? So, or they might ask, are there no adaptations for attractiveness or beauty? How do you respond to that?
So I think, again, this is something I've literally just written, so I'm hoping that people are gonna let it be published. I think there's a couple of different things. So one is that, for instance, when we are creating these stimuli, we usually, for instance, in terms of masculinity, femininity, will push a face to the point where it is androgynous. So it has a shape that's halfway between male and female average. I don't tend to take it any further, because the computer graphics actually don't provide a good stimulus when you do that, because it gets too glitchy. So I don't know what would happen if I showed people in these communities a face that has the shape of the average male face, but in all other respects, has the color cues and hair cues perhaps of a female face. Maybe they would start to care about femininity and masculinity then, if I pushed it all the way. So it might just be that their range of acceptable femininity or masculinity is much broader and much less specific than ours, and that what's happened in Western culture is that our beauty ideals have become more narrow. But the other thing is that there might still be biases that we just haven't pushed the stimuli far enough to encounter them. I think in terms of adaptations, I mean, humans have really flexible brains, and that in itself is an adaptation. We learn what people look like because we're born with a relatively simplistic facial template, we think, that then gets elaborated through experience. And that's incredibly useful because it allows us to learn what our species is, for instance, what male and female exemplars in our species are. And there are forms of this kind of learning in non-human animals as well. It just seems like in humans, it's more elaborated, and our partner preferences are perhaps a bit more affected by it. So I think everything I am talking about is still arising from adaptations. So my question has always been, what do humans as a species do? And whatever it is that humans as a species do, it's arising from the brains that we have evolved. It just might be that what we have been evolving is much more flexibility than we had previously realized. But that doesn't mean I reject the idea that the human brain has evolved at all. I think, of course, it has.
But so you call yourself an evolutionary psychologist. That's what you are.
I was.
Right?
I don't call myself that now.
Okay, yeah. Because I was wondering, because people, I don't know, I've heard people say that there's evolutionary psychology with like a capital E, where there's certain, I don't know, assumptions, I guess, that are built into what they're doing. And there's people who just, I don't know, generally accept that the brain is, adapted, an adaptation in some way, and so they don't, they don't hesitate to like sometimes speculate or like draw inspiration from like evolutionary hypotheses, or I don't know, it's kind of
Yeah.
like a complex field. How do you see the field and that what evolutionary psychology is?
So I think you're right. We absolutely do talk about whether someone is a capital E, capital P evolutionary psychologist or whether they're not. I think within people who would call themselves evolutionary psychologists, you've got the people who are coming from a very sort of a real capital E, capital P evolutionary psychology framework, which is really building around we have specific adaptations that have evolved at specific times and places that do specific things, um, and all humans have these adaptations, even if they trigger slightly differently in different contexts. And a lot of that is really focusing on like understanding human cognition. And there's some really, really interesting, actually good work going on there, in terms of things like how children learn like about poisonous versus non-poisonous plants and what's going on in the brain that's specialized to start identifying and learning these sorts of things. And then you have those who might also call themselves actually capital E, capital P evolutionary psychologists, who are less focused on those kinds of tight modularity cognitive processes, and are more focused on, well, humans evolved in past environments that had these pressures, and therefore we're predicting these outcomes. And I think a lot of the people working on sexual selection and human mate choice are in that category. So they're not getting into the really strict cognitive processes and cognitive modules arguments that are happening on one side, but they are still 100% of the time, always focused on, right, what was past sexual selection, what should the selection process be, therefore what should the outcomes be. But I think there's also more broadly the people who either don't agree the brain is that modular and therefore don't follow what we call the Santa Barbara evolutionary psychology approach, or don't think that we can really evaluate past selection pressures as well as some of the other people do, and therefore veer away from that, but who are nevertheless interested in understanding humans as having evolved as a species and understanding what humans do. There's also people, a fourth group, who might call themselves evolutionary psychologists, who don't necessarily have a very strong understanding of evolution, or human paleoanthropology, or human anthropology, and who will make evolutionary statements that are not well grounded, not well justified, and often are tying into some less than ideal social attitudes. So, for instance, work on, I'm going to quote, national IQ. How intelligent are people in this country? There's no good data on that. That is a thing I could rant about for a long time, but I think that's a topic for a different podcast. But nevertheless, they'll throw out hypotheses that are evolutionary about why some countries are, quote, more intelligent than others, that are actually really badly formulated. So because you've got such a big range of people doing different work, all falling under what outsiders would call evolutionary psychology, it can be difficult to use that term. So some people try and call themselves something else, like evolutionary behavioral scientists, evolutionary social scientists. There's also people working actually in self-identified different disciplines like behavioral ecology or human or cultural evolution studies, that would argue that they're quite distinct, but are still interested in this question of what do humans as a species do across different contexts. So personally, I tend to call myself these days a cross-cultural psychologist / anthropologist, because what I'm doing right now is really focusing on this question of what's happening in different cultural contexts. And I just take the fact that humans have evolved brains as a given, rather than my research being guided by hunting for adaptations. Does that make sense? That was a very long answer to that question, but
very cogent as well. So yeah.
So riffing off your self-proclaimed label of a cross-cultural psychologist, we've sort of talked so far about how disinterest in facial masculinity or femininity is might be an exception to a rule.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned larger bodies. Could you maybe talk more about preferences from other places, since you've looked at some of the anthropological data that might sound very unintuitive to, let's say, people in Northern Europe?
So I think I don't know. I think, generally speaking, I think that the complete lack of interest in facial femininity in our Nicaraguan participants is something that a lot of people would find surprising. If I showed you the stimuli, any global north living person would go, okay, really? I think likewise, the fact that amongst the Hadza in Tanzania, they don't care if the woman's body curves or if it's just straight up and down is relatively unexpected. I mean, we also observed in Nicaragua certain, say within the Afro descent communities, when we gave men a laptop and said, if you use these sliders on the software, you can create your ideal woman. Please create your ideal woman for us. And, we helped a bit with that. The differences between the communities, within the same ethnic group, between those who did and did not have TB access were really dramatic. Obviously this ties into, we're asking men to create their ideal woman, so we are automatically opening the door to sexualization of women and their very gendered attitudes. But the low media communities were producing an ideal woman who was extremely large in the bottom half of her body, and they weren't particularly interested in the breasts. Whereas in the high media community from the same ethnic group, and these communities, you can literally see them across the lagoon from each other. Like they're close enough that if you have a motorboat, it takes you half an hour to get between them. If you don't have a motorboat, it takes longer, but they're that close. But the high media community was producing an ideal woman from the men's perspective, who was more like what we would call a slightly plus size model. And she was curvy, so she was sort of actually healthy weight. She was healthy weight, as we'd call it in Western medical terms. But yeah, more curvy, more on the top half, smaller waist. But I think one thing that is very interesting is that when you look at mentions of like plumpness and beauty across cultures, one anthropologist, sort of bringing a lot of data together, found that actually the communities with the least interest in plumpness as a beauty indicator were those that had the highest risk of starvation, which was really surprising to me when I read that, because that was a paper that I ought to have read several years ago, and I'd heard someone mention it, and they had reported it to me the other way around. And so I have miscited that paper a couple of times. And when I actually read it for myself, I was like, oh no, this is like, this has been counter evidence to this idea that weight preference is to do with hunger. But like over a decade now.
That does happen.
So I mean, basically there's two different people analysed that data in different ways, found different things. But I think the one that said, no, it's not. We're not seeing this plumpness preference in high starvation risk context. I think her analysis is actually better, and therefore the more convincing. So, yeah, and then you get the way that people like enhance their appearance can be really different in different places.
Mm.
And that's it just goes to show that there are things that we think look good and other people think look weird. And frankly, this happens within cultures as well. So I personally, being someone who grew up in the 90s, I think that lip fillers look really weird because I'd never seen them until I was well into adulthood. And yet, you know, if you're growing up and that's what you're used to seeing on TV and indeed around you, because fillers are so easy to access, it looks kind of normal. Or the I don't know if you've seen these articles about how all the women in the Republican Party in the States, all the wives, they all look the same.
Oh, really?
They all had the same plastic surgery. They've all got the same hair.
They call it like a Mar-a-Lago face or something.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Right.
Yeah.
So that's an example of where to one cultural group that looks completely normal and desirable, and then to people outside that group it looks kind of weird. And I think we get these clusterings of appearance preferences in lots of different places and lots of different ways.
I don't think I'll ever get the chance to ask this question like in a public setting, but what is up with breasts? Because you said earlier, said earlier that like there was kind of like a mystery or whatever, something to that effect. And then you said like that it seems like people have access to TV and stuff seem to prefer like big breasts. What is particularly like mysterious about that, or are there any other variations that are strange?
So the fact that humans have breasts all the time is in itself weird. So in other species, like they don't appear until first pregnancy, for instance, or they might come and go, or you know, udders on cows are. Udders on cows are something we have helped create to be the size they are because we've bred cows for milk. And in non-milked species that they're not like that. So yeah, on one hand, there needs to be an explanation, like why do human females grow breasts at puberty rather than when they first get pregnant? And lots of different hypotheses. Is it about estrogen? Is it demonstrating how fertile you are? Possibly, and I think probably a slightly better explanation is that it there's a lot to grow. When you are pregnant, actually, for the first time, you do grow more breast tissue. So you grow more all the little glands that are going to produce the milk. But that affect potentially because of the shape of our bodies, because of everything else we've got going on, because we've got to grow these giant brains and then use these giant brains, which takes so much energy, that it's just much more efficient to be growing them during puberty so that they're there and ready to grow a bit more in the first pregnancy, which for the majority of our existence would have been not long after, bearing in mind that girls in less nutritionally rich environments don't start their periods till they're about 17. So potentially it's just getting the breasts sort of half or most of the way there, ready for the first pregnancy. And then they hang around in between because actually, again, if you look at non-contracepting, high fertility contexts, there's not necessarily that long between when you stop breastfeeding one child and you're pregnant with the next. So like maybe we have them all the time because that's just how that's just the best way to do it if you need them all the time as soon as you hit puberty. In terms of why we fixate on them as a source of attractiveness, people have said, well, is it indicating fertility? I think the best of these arguments was those who argued that it's indicating your embodied capital for then nurture for feeding your child. So you're selecting
Could you quickly
a female
define
who can
embodied capital?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So that you're effectively, what are the resources, literally the resources that exist in your body? So in this instance, do you have fat stores that you can then convert into milk for your child, so that your child grows its big brain very efficiently. So people have looked at, for instance, like what is pre-pregnancy breast size versus fat content in milk, because humans need quite a fatty milk to grow, because we've got to coat all of our neurons in a thin layer of a form of fat cells, myelin. So I think that's like the best explanation of those. But I think we then get slightly caught up in the problem that interest in breasts as a sexual signal is culturally specific. And I think it's mainly seen in contexts where you don't see the breasts very much. So if you're in a context where women have their breasts out all the time, they're not so interesting. When women tend to have their breasts covered, then they are interesting. Yeah, that's the thing we come back to, is that yet again it's something that we only treat as a sexual signal in certain cultures and not others.
So I guess this might be a good point where we might switch gears a bit and sort of
keeping in mind that we've already gone over the hour mark, so we have to.
Yeah, mindful of that. Could you maybe sketch out the implications of the learning account that you proposed for maybe our understanding of dating in contemporary populations? And we asked this question just because old work in evolutionary psychology has been interpreted by lay people as having real consequences for dating, and therefore there has been advice that has been doled out to the general population about this. So maybe if you could speak to that, that could be a nice way to sort of wrap up the episode as well.
So I think there's, I guess there's 2 points to make. One is that if what we think is attractive is always being shaped by our visual experience, then you're probably not needing to worry about these deep underlying biological meanings of what someone looks like. You just need to bear in mind that what you like has been shaped by your past experience, and also that if you change what you look at, you will change what you want to look at. If you're a man watching a lot of pornography, you are seeing female bodies that are very different to the real female bodies around you. You're also seeing male bodies that are often potentially quite muscular, very unrealistic. You're going to feel worse about your own body. You should not do that. You should let go of that and get yourself a slightly healthier media diet. Likewise for women and their body image. The less time you spend looking at models, the happier and more confident you'll feel in yourself. Which leads us into the other point, which is that actually when it comes to what people will say they want in a partner, we know that physical attractiveness is actually relatively low down the most important things list after, nice personality or someone who loves you. I'm trying to remember the specific list from the BUS 1989 study, like dependable character, mutual love, dependable character, things like that. And confidence. We know in all sorts of social science research that confidence is incredibly socially powerful. And I think some of what these advice books are doing is they are this is very similar to this area of evolutionary psychology I talked about, where it's not done very well. So they're taking these evolutionary ideas and they are massively misapplying them, and then creating this sort of expectancy of social dynamics that isn't really going to happen. And actually, people being a bit more confident just in themselves for who they are is probably the best idea, because ultimately then we end up assorting on interests. Social psychologists have known for 60 years that the single most important thing in attractiveness is whether you share interests and attitudes.
This is going to be the Instagram reel when we market this episode.
Yes, the dating advice.
Yeah.
Believe in yourself. Be yourself.
I mean, it sounds
Yeah.
cheesy, but it's true.
No, but it is. That's
So-
probably why we say
It's
it,
true.
right?
Because if you believe in yourself,
Yeah.
then you don't push too hard and you get on with it. And then, yeah.
Mm. Yeah. You actually listen to people and
Yes. Have an actual conversation. And I say that with a lot of love and sympathy, because I find talking to strangers quite hard if I don't have a specific topic that I know I can talk to them about. So I know it's not always easy. But yeah, there's a reason people talk about becoming more attractive when they're already in a relationship, and it's usually because you're just a bit more chill and confident, and therefore that in itself is attractive.
there you go. So wrapping up, there's usually two questions we ask guests. The first one is there anything that you think we've missed or that you want to make a bit more clear, a bit more precise? Go over again really quick.
No, I don't think so.
Mhm.
I think that's the main things.
And second is there like a bit of media? It can be something about the topics you've been discussing, but it can also be something that illustrates or reflects what we've been talking about. It can be a novel, a book, or anything you'd like to recommend.
Oh, you mean
Or a
for people to
film or-
consume to?
Yeah.
What an interesting idea. I don't know off the top of my head. So many depictions of attraction and stuff like that in media are so bad that it's very hard to have anything to recommend.
Yeah. What's a good one, do you think? Do you think
A
any
good
of them
one.
are good?
You know what I really like, and this broadly in terms of like screen romance, the show Heartstopper in series 1. So it's about basically a gay boy and a bisexual boy at school realizing they like each other. And what I think is so good about it is that it displays such all-round healthy relationship behaviors. When there's conflict, they talk about it. When it comes to what they like about each other, it's about really gelling as individuals. And that first series where everything's more or less happy before things get more complicated later on. Is the main couple, but also the side couple who are starting to get to like each other. It's all just really lovely, normal but also healthy teen relationships, and you don't see that very much on TV.
To wrap the episode up, this has been Cogitations. We've been chatting with Professor Lynda Boothroyd. Thanks so much for joining us on the show today, Lynda.
You're very welcome.